Welcome to today's interview. We're excited to have you here and learn more about your experience and skills. This role is crucial for us, and we're interested in your proficiency with React and .NET. Let's start by having you introduce yourself or share a bit about how you got started in software engineering. You're welcome. All right, let's dive into it. So, Eduardo, what's the difference between an SQL inner join and an SQL left join?
Okay, a SQL inner join and a specific type of join to returns only the rows where there is a match in the both tables based in the join condition. Well,
Hmm. Okay, I see what you're saying about matches in both tables. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more? For example, how does the behavior of a left join differ when there's no match between the tables?
a left join returns all the rows from the left table, even if it's not matching row in the right table. When there is not match, the result will still include in the left table row, but the columns from the right table will have the null values.
Got it. That explanation makes sense. A left join includes all rows from the left table, even if there's no match in the right table, and fills in null values for missing data. Thanks for breaking it down. All right, now let's move on to the next topic. What are ways of making data available in a component?
The data can be made available in React component in several ways. We can use props, state, context API, Redux, or another state managed libraries, fetching data inside the component, local storage or session storage.
All right, that's a good overview. I like that you mentioned options like props and state, as well as external tools like Redux. Could you give an example of when you choose Context API over Redux for managing data?
Well, I will choose a context API over Redux when the data to share is simple and limited in scope. For example, if I need to share the theme settings, user language, or authentication status across a few components, context API is easier and faster to set up. Context API is built into React, so it does not require adding extra libraries or complex setup.
Right, that's a great point. Context API is definitely a lighter option for simpler data sharing needs compared to something like Redux. All right, let's shift gears a little now. What's the significance of keys in React?
Okay, keys in React are special identifiers used when rendering a list of elements. They help React identify which items have changed, been added, or removed. Also, using keys improves their performance by allowing React to update only the change element instead of redirecting the entire list.
Yeah, absolutely. App keys are essential for efficient rendering, especially with dynamic lists. Could you maybe share an example where you've used keys to fix an issue around list rendering or performance?
Okay, for example, in one project I work with on a feature that display a list of user tasks that could be added or removed or updated dynamically. Initially, the list items did not have unit keys, so React rendered the entire list every time a change happened, causing performance issues and UI friction. I fix this by assigning each tags and unique ID from the database and use that ID as a key for each list item. After adding keys React was able to track which tags change and only re-render those specific items.
Oh, that's a solid example. It's great you tied it directly to a real project with performance improvements. Making those changes sounds like it had a noticeable impact. All right, moving forward, what's the difference between map, filter, and reduce?
Okay, okay, the difference between filter and reduce in JavaScript. Filter creates a new array with elements that pass a test, like a condition, and the callback function, and keeps only the element that return the true or for the condition. And reduce, it means that they array to single value by applying the function to each element and accumulating the result, and also can be used for many purposes like summing numbers, combine objects, or building new data structure.
Okay, that makes sense. You've explained filter and reduce pretty well. Maybe let's include map in the discussion too. Could you walk me through how it compares to filter and reduce? For example, when would you choose map over the others?
Okay, map is used when you want to transform each element in an array and get a new array from the same length. You choose array, you choose map when you need to change or update every item, like convert a number to string or extract a property from objects. Filter is for selecting elements that meet a condition, so the output array may be smaller. Reduce is for combine all elements into a single value, like a summon or create an object. And finally, I use map when I want to keep the array structure but change the context and each element.
Got it. That's a clear breakdown of when to use map, filter, or reduce depending on the kind of transformation or result you need. Thanks for clarifying. All right, let's move to the next question. What is prop drilling and how would you architect an application to avoid it?
Okay, a prop drilling is when you pass data through many layers of components just to reach a deeply niched shell component. It can make the code hard to read and maintain because many companies receive the props they don't use directly. The To avoid prop dialing, I use the managed technicals like a context API or state managed libraries like a Redux. Also decide components to be more focused and use the composition to reduce unnecessary prop passing.
Right, that's a good explanation of prop drilling and how it can complicate the structure of an app. And I like that you mentioned things like Redux and Context API as solutions. Could you share an example of a project where you had to deal with or avoid prop drilling? How did you handle it?
Okay. Well, in my role at Telcel, I work on an internal system where the user preferences need to be accessed by many nest components. Initially, the preferences were passed down through the multiple component layers, which made the code complex and hard to maintain. To solve this, I implement a React Context API to uh, to store and provide the provide user preferences globally. This way, any component that in the tree could be accessed the preference directly without passing props through intermediate components. Using Context API reduce the amount of prop passing and simplify the component structure.
Oh, that's a really solid example. I like how you used Context API to simplify things and make the app more maintainable. All right, let's move to the next question. Can you describe, in the context of Redux, what an action, reducer, and store are?
Okay, for example, action, it's a plain JavaScript object that describes what happened in the app. It must have a type property that tells the reducer what kind of action it is. It can also have a payload with data need to update the state. Reducer, in this case, is a pure function that takes the current state and an action as input. It returns a new state based on the action type and payload. Finally, store holds the whole state of the app in one place and allows the access for the state. This dispatching action and regurgitates listening for the steps change.
Okay, that's a clear explanation of the roles each part plays in Redux. To dive a little deeper, could you give an example of an action reducer store flow you've implemented in a project? For instance, how did they interact?
Okay. In another project at Telcel, I work in a system where the user could update their profile information when the user submit submit change and an action was dispatched with type update profile and the new data as payload. The user listening for the update profile action type and create a new state with the update user profile without mutating the old state. The stop held the user profile state and update it when the user return and the new state. Um, the component subscribed through this to the store receive the update profile, the profile data, and redact it accordingly. And this flow ensures that state changes were predicted and centralized, making debugging and maintenance easier.
Oh, that's a great example. I can see how that centralized state made everything easier to manage and maintain. Let's switch gears now. Can you explain what inversion of control IOC is?
Okay, inversion of control is a principle where the control of objects or paths or the program is transferred to a container or framework. Instead of the program controlling the flow and the framework or container controls.
All right, that's a good start. So, IOC simplifies dependency management by shifting control. Could you name some tools or libraries you've worked with that implement IOC and maybe share a quick example?
Okay, I have worked with .NET Core, which has a built-in support for IOC, so it's dependency injection container. In .NET Core, you register services in a startup configuration, and the framework injects them where needed. Um, uh,
That's a solid example. .NET Core's built-in support for dependency injection definitely makes implementing IOC pretty straightforward. Great explanation. All right, next question. How do you create a RESTful service using ASP.NET?
Um, well, to create a RESTful services and ASP.NET, I usually use ASP.NET Core Web API. First, I create a new Web API project with using Visual Studio for the .NET Cell LA. Then I define the controller classes then, that inherit from controller base. Each controller handles each HTTP request for specific resource like users or products or something like that. I use attributes like HTTP GET, HTTP POST, HTTP PUT, and HTTP DELETE for the math methods to HTTP verbs. Inside that these methods, I write code to handle requests and interact with the database and return the response. I use independence injection to inject services that handle business logic and data access.
All right, sounds good. You've mentioned setting up controllers using HTTP verbs and dependency injection. To make sure I've got the full picture, could you walk me through what happens when a client sends a request to one of those REST endpoints? Maybe just talk through how the request is processed before the response goes back.
Okay, when a client sends a request for a REST endpoint in SVN.NET, the request first research the ASP.NET Core middleware pipeline. The middleware components process the request step by step, such as routing, authentication, and login. The routing middleware match the request URL and HTTP method to the correct controller and an action method. ISP.NET Core creates an instance of the controller, injected any required services via dependency injection, and the matched action method execute using injected services or handled business logic or data access. Um, the result is converted into HTTP response with the appropriate status code. The data format is usually that I use JSON. And finally, the response goes back through the middleware pipeline, which can modify or log before sending to the client.
Great, that's a thorough walkthrough of the process. You covered the pipeline, routing, and the response format clearly. Now, let's move on. How do you access data in a database from a .NET application?
In that .NET application, I access the data using Entity Framework Core or ADO.NET, depending the projects needed. With Entity Framework, I use Object Relational Mapper or AM to work with databases using C# objects instead of raw SQL. Um, First, I create entity classes that represent the database tables. Then I create DB context class to manage the connection and maps entity tables. I use link queries to read, insert, or update or delete data through the DB context. Also, I create store procedures in SQL Server. Then I call them from .NET when I need it.
All right, that makes sense. It's great that you've worked with both Entity Framework and ADO.NET depending on project needs. Could you give a brief example of a scenario where you chose ADO.NET over Entity Framework and why?
Okay. I choose ADO.NET over Entity Framework in a project where the performance and fine control over SQL queries were critical. The project involved complex query and store procedures that need to be highly optimized. I use IDEO.NET uh, over Entity Framework. Um, in contrast, I prefer or I choose Entity Framework because it's easier to faster to simplify the code, create, read, update or delete operation, but I can't add overhead and complex scenarios.
Got it. That makes sense, especially when performance and control are priorities in complex scenarios. All right, let's move to the next topic. What is a generic type and how do you use it in .NET?
Okay, generic type in .NET is a class or method or interface that works with any data type while keeping type safely. It allows to write code that can handle different types without repeating the same code for each time.
All right, that's a good explanation of generic types. Now, to dive a bit deeper, can you explain the difference between value types and reference types in .NET and how they relate to generics?
Okay, the value types to store directly while reference reference types to store references for the data in memory. Um, Value types include simple types like a integer, boolean, struct, and something like that. Reference types includes cases, arrays, and strings, are are stored to heap. When you're using a reference type, you copy the reference, not the actual data.
Exactly, you described that well. Value types store the actual data, while reference types handle the reference to the memory location. All right, moving on, how do you push database changes using Entity Framework?
To push changes to the database using Entity Framework, I
Could you
follow.
elaborate on that? How would you approach pushing database changes using Entity Framework specifically? For instance, could you explain the steps you take?
Okay. First, I modified the entity objects in the DB context, such as adding, update, or deleted entities. Um, After that, update an existing entity and modify its properties directly after retrieving for the DB context. Um, Finally, the entity framework generates two appropriate SQL commands like insert, update, or delete based on my change, and use save changes to return a number or of after rows, which helps to verify the operation is success.
Great, that's a good explanation. Modifying entities, tracking changes, and then using save changes to commit sounds like you've got a solid grasp of the process. That was the final technical question I had for you. Do you have any questions for me about the role or the company?
No, I don't have question.
All right, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. We appreciate your insights and expertise, and we're glad to get to know you a bit better. We will review everything we've discussed and be in touch within the next 2 to 3 business days with the next steps. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.